This is going to be a long video, I'll tell you right now. So, like, grab a coffee, grab a tea, get comfy, get a blanket. We're in for the long haul, so just buckle up. So looking back at everything that I read in 2022, I was really surprised to see how different it was from the year that I had in mind. So I had this big list of books that I wanted to read. Here, I'll even read it to you. And I read like almost none of them. So anyway, so the list is Jonathan Franzen, Crossroads, Jonathan Franzen, The Corrections, Philip K. Dick's The Exegesis of Philip K. Dick, Thomas Pynchon, Vineland, David Foster Wallace, A Supposedly Fun Thing I'll Never Do Again, The Broom of the System, and Brief Interviews with Hideous Men, W.G. Sebald, The Rings of Saturn, Laszlo Krasnohorkai, Saibo There Below, and Nathan Hill, The Knicks. So a big error in my part was, one, planning out books to read, never a good idea, and two, planning to read books that I didn't even own, which like isn't the end of the world, but like if it's on my shelf and it's like staring me down every day, I'm more motivated to read it so it stops like, bothering me. So most of the books on that list I like don't even own. Some of them I do, and like one of them I read. For the most part, all of the planning I did just went like straight out the window, and I just ended up reading like whatever I wanted to. So it was a year of spontaneity. It was a year of just like diving headfirst into subjects I didn't know I cared about. It was a year of like just curiosity and impulsive, spontaneous reading. I'm not normally someone who like keeps up with all of the latest releases. Most of the books I read are just like older fiction titles that have been published like decades ago. So to look back at everything and to see that like almost everything I read this year was a new nonfiction release, like the complete opposite of what I had planned to read, it was like really surprising to see. All that being said, it was a very good year for reading, and I ended up reading a total of 17 books. Not that the number matters or anything, but it was a very good year of books. I ended up trying out a couple new things. I listened to or read my first audiobook. I read a bunch of graphic novels that I don't normally, again, that's not something I normally do. And again, I just dove headfirst into these nonfiction subjects that I had never read about before. So it was really interesting, really cool. So the video is going to be structured into different sections. So nonfiction is going to kind of have its own category, like roughly grouped by subject, but like not really. Audiobooks will have their own section, and then graphics will have their own section. And I'll end the video with fiction along with my 2022 book of the year. We'll go ahead and start off with nonfiction. In 2021, I went down this art heist true crime rabbit hole with like a very specific focus on the Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum, which all started when I watched the Netflix docuseries This Is a Robbery. So from there, I read 4 art heist books in a row that went from like 2021 and then like spilled over into 2022. So those 4 books were The Woman Who Stole Vermeer by Anthony Amore, who, funnily enough, is the security director at the Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum. And I didn't know who he was when I read this book. The second was The Gardner Heist by Ulrich Boser. The third was Master Thieves, the Boston gangsters who pulled off the world's greatest art heist by Stephen Kirkchin, which is like absolutely incredible, by the way. Like the very best like written accounts of the Gardner Heist. And then spilling into the beginning of 2022 is Art and Crime, the fight against looters, forgers, and fraudsters in the high-stakes art world. So this was something that was like originally published in 2020 in German, and then translated into English for this 2022 release. I picked it up primarily because the blurb mentions the Gardner Museum heist of 1990, and I figured like since 2015, when Stephen Kirkchin's book came out, that there would have been some new developments or new things to say about it, since, so much has happened since 2015 to present day regarding this case. But they like barely mentioned it. It was really disappointing. A bunch of the book is fine. It has a lot of like good stories in it, but like specifically the bit on the Gardner heist is like really, really lacking. It's like the most like basic like Wikipedia entry, like on March 18th, 2 men disguised as police officers, etc., etc. Like, I was hoping for something new, and it was just not, it didn't bring anything new to the table regarding that specific bit that I picked the book up for in the first place. Most of the stories in the book are pretty good. There's some really interesting ones, like the theft of this like 220-pound giant gold coin the size of a car tire. There's the theft of the Mona Lisa, and there's a whole bunch of accounts of like art forgery and like destruction and like smuggling that took place in World War II. Since the authors are German, there's this major focus on German history, and this one bizarre and fascinating chapter about like all of the things that end up on like the secondary gray art market of just items that supposedly belonged to Hitler, but like they're completely ridiculous that people buy them up anyways. Apart from like a couple select stories, like most of Art and Crime is a big letdown. There's like an extraordinarily large amount of just untranslated German text that just like slows everything to a crawl. Just name after name and then like date after date, and then like just giant sums of money of like this painting sold for like this many hundreds of thousands of euros, and this painting sold for this hundred thousands of euros. It's a real slog at the end of it, and it reads like a textbook. I was hoping like most of them would read kind of like a thriller, but like, you know, a real thriller, and most of them ended up just being a real slog and not fun to read. It's worth borrowing this book for the few stories that are good, because like they are legitimately interesting. Just be sure to skip the boring bits. So the next nonfiction book I read was a book of interviews with Steve Reich. It's Steve Reich Conversations, published in 2022. Steve Reich is one of my favorite composers, right up there with Philip Glass, so I thought that reading a book of interviews would be really interesting and would be worthwhile and be worth my time. Unfortunately, a lot of it is just really dry and not interesting, even to someone who really enjoys his music and is very familiar with all of the things that they're talking about. It doesn't bring a lot to the table, and it's not an enjoyable reading experience. What made the book even more dry is knowing that it's just a bunch of Zoom conversations that have been transcribed. I've read a couple books of interviews before that are good, specifically the last interview with Philip K. Dick. This one's really great. That whole series is really great. And then another one, a music-related one, is Stockhausen on music, which is really only worth it if you've ever listened to his music. What made Steve Reich Conversations so upsetting is that, like, even though I have a deep understanding of his music and I've listened to like almost everything, it's still not a fun read. For the most part, it's like, I think I like to just listen to people talk, and I'd rather just listen to a recording of these conversations. The natural ebb and flow of conversation doesn't always translate to text. Conversations does assume, if not require, a deep familiarity with his music, like I've said before, but even then it wasn't worth my time, and you're better off just listening to his music or like listening to an interview if that's what you're looking for. The next nonfiction book I read was David Sedaris' 2022 release, Happy Go Lucky. I think this is categorized as like an essay collection, but it's really more of autobiographical short stories, memoirs, and like tidbits. There's nothing like super argumentative or like academic here, like, you know, essays normally are. It's just nice, light nonfiction. So what makes this book so great is there's all these different topics that he talks about and writes about so lightheartedly and so in this like ridiculously funny voice. Things like from shooting guns with his sister to like feeding gummy worms to ants and like dealing with like the really complicated and bizarre relationship he has with his father. He'll juxtapose that with really just like heartfelt moments that are less funny, more human, more touching. The length of the essays is perfect too. Like you can read them in a sitting or two, and you can just like read them during like a lunch break or something, which is what I did. I read like one or two of these during my lunch breaks. There are plenty of jokes in here that won't land for everyone, but that's kind of like David Sedaris' whole shtick, is that he rides that fine line between being okay and not. He's just kind of like edgy, silly, ridiculous humor. But all of this doesn't detract from an otherwise excellent read. So by the time this video comes out, it'll probably be too late to buy Christmas presents, but this is an excellent gift for anyone who likes puzzles, even remotely. Any kind of puzzle, any kind, this is a great gift. The only thing I'll say is be sure to get a physical copy. No ebooks, no audiobooks, because at the end of every chapter are puzzles that you can do yourself. You can't write an audiobook, and you can't write an ebook either. So this is A.J. Jacobs' The Puzzler, which came out in 2022. It's One man's quest to solve the most baffling puzzles ever, from crosswords to jigsaws to the meaning of life. So A.J. Jacobs is someone who I only recently learned about. He's like, I guess a bit of like an immersion journalist. Like part of what he does is he'll just do like lifestyle experiments on himself and then he'll just write about it. So there's The Year of Living Biblically. There's this book where he like outsourced his entire life, a whole bunch of different like experiments, and he just writes about them. In The Puzzler, Jacobs seeks out all of the most difficult puzzles of all kinds, crosswords, Sudoku, Ken-Ken, corn mazes, Rubik's Cubes and other twisty puzzles, jigsaw puzzles, and even plain old word puzzles and riddles, and attempts to solve the absolute hardest of each of them. The book itself contains a hidden puzzle and a sizable cash prize for submitting the right answer. So each chapter is dedicated to a different kind of puzzle, its history, and then Jacobs attempts to solve like the absolute worst of them, or like the most difficult version of them. And then at the end of each section are puzzles that the reader can do. There's like the first ever crossword that appeared in newspapers. There's the most difficult crossword ever in here, supposedly. And there's these beautiful glossy pictures of these other puzzles too. Like there's a jigsaw puzzle that's like an octopus, and you can put it together pretty easily, but there's only one correct solution in that like all of the octopus's tentacles like fit inside of like this coral reef thing. It's insane. I can't even begin to describe it. So like in the middle here is this like enormous puzzle of like a Jackson Pollock painting, which is ridiculous. Who would do this? I guess A.J. Jacobs would. Very cool, very pretty. In all honesty, I bought a physical copy of this book fully intending to do the puzzles at the end of each chapter, but the writing was so good and so funny and witty and charming that I just wanted to keep reading it and keep reading it. So I haven't done any of the puzzles yet. But it's nice to know that they're there in case I ever want to go back and do them. So this book like rekindled an old hobby of mine. It just like made me want to start doing puzzles again, specifically crosswords, and showed me this whole other world of new ones to try as well. Because of this book, I also discovered my newfound love of jigsaw puzzles. Jigsaw enthusiasts in The Puzzler describe a zen-like state of mental clarity, relaxation, and focus that they fall into when doing their puzzles. And so one day I tried doing them and found that the same thing happened for me, in that time just melts away and I can just do them for literal hours on end. So The Puzzler by A.J. Jacobs is a great gift, even if you end up buying it for yourself. The next nonfiction book I read was W. Timothy Gallwey's The Inner Game of Tennis. This short book is one of the most important sports psychology books ever written. Its wisdom is universal and its teachings extend far beyond the lines of the tennis court. The philosophy of the inner game has been applied to all sorts of like non-tennis things as well, from competing in other sports to fostering better mental well-being off the court. In The Inner Game of Tennis, Gallwey emphasizes the difference between each player's self-1 and self-2, effectively the conscious and the unconscious mind, and teaches how to silence the loud self-1 and let the unconscious self-2 take over. A bulk of the success relies in your ability to succeed in like visualizing how you want things to turn out and looking at the results as they are objectively, non-judgmentally, and without like self-loathing or anything. So instead of saying like I hit this ball really well or like really poorly, it's like this ball landed here. And you sort of visualize how you want it to turn out and remember like sort of like the muscle memory of how everything works, and then that eventually translates into this deeper muscle memory and like better mental clarity way of playing, where you're not like, okay, hold the racket like this and then do exactly this and remember to follow through. Because if you're like coaching yourself with self-1, then all of that just like clouds your mental game, and that gets in the way of actually doing what you're truly capable of, which is your self-2, the part that does things automatically. And without that active self-1 thinking. So this model of letting self-2 take over is counter to the way that most people try to do things, which is, yelling at themselves and being like, no, don't do this, hold the racket this way, remember to follow through, like move your leg this way, no, you idiot, things like that. It's really just a mindset that you get yourself into, and it's a way of playing on the court, and it's a way of practicing in a way that fosters better mental clarity and better mindset in general. And like, I don't play tennis. I haven't played tennis for years, but this is just a good way of thinking about things in general. Even if you've never played a sport in your life, this book is really helpful for mindfulness in general. The next book in psychology and wellness and mindfulness is Thich Nhat Hanh, How to Focus, published in 2022. This book is absolutely tiny. It's like I think like only 100 pages. Yeah, like 100 something pages. I read this in a single sitting, and I probably shouldn't have, because it's like something that it's better to return to and just read in small doses, and just to come back to and use as like a reference rather than to like just breeze through the whole thing. And I think the reading would benefit, maybe obviously, from slower, more mindful reading than to just like, breeze through the entire thing. How to Focus is more of like a crash course on mindfulness and different forms of meditation, specifically walking meditation, which Thich Nhat Hanh is a big advocate of, in which you sort of walk and you take breaths in time with your walking, and you're very conscious of like, I'm touching the ground beneath me and I'm connected to the earth, and things like that. It's hard to explain, but he explains it very, very well and in very simple language in a way that makes a lot of sense. It also promotes these other kinds of meditation that are helpful for just, reflecting on things and, taking, like, counting your breaths in and then counting your breaths out and just focusing on that for extended periods of time, and how that can just act as a mental reset and how that can just better your mental game throughout the rest of the day. So each page is like a little mini lesson by itself. It talks about like living in the moment and like not worrying about petty things like the dishes, or like, getting into stupid arguments with friends or loved ones. And it has these just little nice teachable moments. It's a bit like a page a day calendar that has like a nice quote on it, but this is actually helpful and actually nice and something you can like, return back to instead of like tear a page off and throw it out. So How to Focus turns all of these like everyday things, like again, doing the dishes and, going for walks and all of that, and it turns them into these little like teachable moments of mindfulness and just being like present in present time, and not like worrying about the future too much and not dwelling on the past, and just sort of like, this is now, this is what's happening, and it's all fine, it's all good. If nothing else, this made me want to start meditating again, which is one of my quote unquote resolutions for 2023. So now we're diving into this subject that I didn't think I would care about, but I read a whole bunch of books about in 2022. They're like anti-social media books. They're like technology and adjacently related to mindfulness and mental well-being and focus and all that stuff. The first one I read was Stolen Focus by Johann Hari, Why You Can't Pay Attention and How to Think Deeply Again, published in 2022. When I first stumbled upon this book, I was like absolutely obsessed with it. It was saying all the things that I'd been thinking or feeling for so long and articulated them in such a way that it made like so much sense. It's about all of the things that affect our focus, like smartphones and social media and, related technologies, but also touches upon things like sleep and nutrition and stress and the way we think and behave on like a day-to-day basis. The book opens with Johann Hari noticing his own lack of focus and how he used to be able to do things, and now he just sort of like scrolls idly on his phone and time just disappears unaccounted for. So in the introduction, he recalls a story about how his godson Adam used to love Elvis when he was a kid and how he danced around and dressed up as him. And then he asked Johann if one day, can we go to Graceland someday? And Johann said, yes, absolutely, not really thinking that would ever happen. And then it snaps back to present day, in which Johann is just like on his phone, and like his godson Adam is now like a teenager, and he's just on his phone doing like nothing. Like it's like Snapchat, Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, just back and forth, constantly doing just not doing anything. And Johann looks up and is like, how did we get here? This is not my beautiful house. And he looks over to his godson and he says, quote, Then one evening, as we lay on a large sofa, each staring at our own ceaselessly shrieking screens, I looked at Adam and felt a low dread. We can't live like this, I said to myself. Adam, I said softly, let's go to Graceland. And so they go to Graceland, and there's no more tour guides. There's just an iPad. They hand you an iPad and say, here, look, here's a tour of everything. You can swipe to see the pictures. And Johann's like, well, you can just look up and you can see the real thing. It's right here. Why is there iPad? Why? Like, Graceland is right here. It doesn't make any sense. They go there under the conditions that Adam doesn't use his phone at all, and that they leave their phones in their hotel room, and they actually try to like be present and enjoy the things that they once liked to do, and not just like constantly scrolling through their phones doing nothing. And so the trip to Graceland completely fails, and like Johann steps back for a second and he tries to think about like what to do and like how to like reset everything and how to become like a human being again. And so he tries this digital detox to try to like unplug from everything in an extreme effort to like regain the mental clarity that he used to have. He trades in his phone for like this really clunky flip phone that's intended for like senior citizens. It has no internet. The only thing it can do is like call a hospital if you fall down or something. It's like the most basic thing you can possibly get. So he gets one of those cell phones. He goes to Provincetown and then just spends his days like writing and reading and like walking on the beach without his phone, that does nothing, and finds that his mental clarity comes back to a degree, and his focus isn't being like fractured all the time by these notifications that just like constantly, beg you to check your phone again and like get you to keep using it, over and over and extended periods of time. And so this detox, it works to a degree, but it doesn't solve everything. And so the rest of the book, he spends sort of exploring what went wrong and like what you can do to fix it on an individual level. The parts of this book that were most interesting to me were the parts that explains the specific techniques that tech companies use to exploit gaps in human psychology. A lot of it is based off of, those like experiments that they do where like the pigeon presses a button and then like it gets a treat, but not every time. Like it'll press a button and sometimes it gets a treat. It's like that. And that entire model is applied to like smartphones, and that like intermittent rewards for, the intended behavior that they want you to do is the most effective in terms of like getting that behavior to be repeated. Because if it's press button, get treat every time, that's good. But for whatever reason, press button, get treat sometimes is more effective, and I don't know why that is. That model is applied to smartphones in the form of like push notifications, in the form of like likes and comments and things like that just like, ping the little dopamine receptor to say like, hey, remember to use iPhone today. It's like insane. It's insane. What's nice about this is that once you understand how these tricks work, is that you can understand how to sort of combat them. You can like turn off notifications, and you can make your phone, send you emails in like a batch, instead of saying like, here's an email, here's an email, here's an email, making you like check all the time. And instead you can be like, I'm gonna get all my emails all at once at 4 p.m. and I'm gonna read all my emails, and that'll be it. No more. So instead of having your focus like interrupted constantly by your phone buzzing and like pinging you all the time, you're allowing yourself to have longer periods of time just uninterrupted by like this little like device that you have. The other part of this that was really interesting was the bit with Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi, the Hungarian psychologist whose research now serves as the foundation of what we now know as the flow states. So in short, the flow state is this psychological phenomenon that happens when someone is doing something that they love that's a little bit challenging for extended periods of time. That's the only thing they're focusing on. It's like putting on like horse blinders, and like you're only doing that, and like all of your mental energy is put towards that. It's also been called for athletes as being like in the zone or in their elements or things like that. When you're in the flow state, your perception of time is distorted and you become truly fully present in what it is that you're doing. He writes about all these things of like, mountain climbers, how like they'll be doing these extremely difficult and like life-threatening tasks, and they're doing it with incredible just focus, and they love it. I don't know what it is. Like they'll do one task for a long period of time, and their brain is just like is in full like focus mode. I don't know how else to describe it. And this same thing is the same phenomenon that's described by people who do like jigsaw puzzles, and that they're in jigsaw mode. That's it. And so one of the best things you can do to better your focus and to like better your mental well-being is to foster these times in which the flow state triggers. So doing one thing at a time, monotasking, doing something that you truly love that is again slightly challenging for extended periods of time to just trigger that flow state. And so in Stolen Focus, Hari talks extensively with Mihaly and explains how beneficial it is to have uninterrupted streams of focus, to put all of your attention into just one task, monotasking, and to do it fully and to do it well. Because when your attention isn't being constantly fractured by these little pings and notifications, it allows for deeper focus, and like your brain can actually like heal and function as it's intended to, instead of having like switching tasks all the time, which is like really like not good for you and not good for your focus. In my review, which I'll link down below, I called this book the single most important book I've read in the last decade. Very, very good. I think definitely my favorite nonfiction book of the year, but not the book of the year. The next social media technology book I read was Cal Newport's Digital Minimalism: Choosing a Focused Life in a Noisy World. So Cal Newport has never had any social media accounts, which is a rarity in today's age, which gives him this really unique perspective on writing this book. So whereas Stolen Focus is more of a primer on like how the technology works and the specifics of how it interrupts your focus, this is more of a guidebook on how to reset everything in like a more practical, long-term way. The title comes from Cal Newport's name for a techno-philosophy that he urges people to adopt, one that is designed to ensure that technology serves the user and is directly in line with their core values instead of just mindlessly using your phone to fill empty time, infinitely scrolling through algorithmically boosted content and being hopelessly sucked into a digital vortex that's purposefully designed to keep you using it as long as possible and to keep you coming back over and over and over. So digital minimalism, as defined by Cal, is a philosophy of technology use in which you focus your online time on a small number of carefully selected and optimized activities that strongly support things you value and happily miss out on everything else. So in practice, the reworking of your techno philosophy involves this digital declutter, specifically not digital detox, in which you cut out all optional online activities. To this, he says, "We didn't sign up for the digital lives we now lead. They were instead, to a large extent, crafted in boardrooms to serve the interests of a select group of technology investors." So again, where Stolen Focus is more of like a deep dive into predatory Silicon Valley practices, like the nitty gritty of like the how and why social media works the way it does and why it's designed the way it is, this is more of like a guidebook and more of like a crash course on the subject, and skims the surface and says, okay, this is bad. It's designed to keep you using your phone as long as possible, and here's how to fix it. Because it's like, it's not too long. It's a very quick and easy read. So if you're interested in this, if you're interested in sort of like resetting everything, this is an approach that's like definitely worth looking into. So Stolen Focus offers a few solutions, like on the individual level, like turning off notifications, some common sense things like that, but it doesn't present a super handy long-term solution. So part of the 30-day digital declutter that he advocates for, part of that involves actively seeking out what he calls analog activities to fill the time that you used to spend just using your phone and just scrolling endlessly. These analog activities are like reading a physical newspaper at a specific time of day or the week instead of trying to just absorb these giant amounts of information through like osmosis through your phone, like getting it in like a news feed or whatever. Another like analog activity that he cites as an example is like using a pen and paper planner instead of like using Google Calendar or like digital planners that rely on you using like a phone or a device or something. Or for another example, like sifting through a box of records and putting one on a turntable instead of just hitting shuffle and skipping tracks whenever is convenient. Obviously different things work for different people. These things aren't all going to be perfect, but the point always circles back to finding things that you actually value and seeking the best activities that support them. So one other thing that he advocates for is this need for high quality leisure time, something that you really enjoy that's intellectually stimulating and or challenging, which conveniently are the same conditions in which the flow state happens. Like these are all things that are good for fostering better, mental health in general, is doing things that are intellectually stimulating and challenging and doing something that you enjoy. Funnily enough, Cal really enjoys YouTube, and he speaks at length about all of the things that you can learn from it if you use it purposefully and with intention. Like, I want to learn how to fix this, I want to learn how to like change a tire or like build this or whatever, and specifically not like falling down YouTube algorithm like rabbit holes or whatever. One thing I didn't like about this book was how remarkably anti-video game it is, which was both surprising and not. So as far as like high quality leisure goes, like yeah, maybe they don't rank super highly among like other things, but they don't deserve like half the flack that Cal Newport gives them. Like yeah, sure, some of them are deliberately designed to keep you playing them for a long time, like mobile games specifically, but it's absolutely not fair for him to just dismiss all of them in the way that he does and to say that they're completely, just throw them in the garbage effectively. All that said, this book is incredibly eye-opening and like very helpful in providing a practical guidebook on how to reset, how you use technology and how to make sure that it serves you, making sure that technology serves you, and making sure that your time isn't just forfeited to your devices. So the third social media book I read this year was Max Fisher, The Chaos Machine, the inside story of how social media rewired our minds and our world, published in 2022. So this was like one of the best social media books I read, but it's also like very, very hard to recommend because the content in it is incredibly like graphic and very, very shocking. It's mostly how social media and like algorithmic content and how all of that just affects society at large and like the very worst things that have happened as a result of like Facebook and Twitter and like Instagram and all that. I won't get into details because of like the stories that this book has, but if you're interested in, the global effects of social media and not just individual level things, then you can definitely check this book out, but just be warned that the stories in there are not for the faint of heart. All that being said, it's a very well written and like very well informed read. So now finally moving on to graphic novels, which I read a couple this year. The first graphic novel I read that wasn't like a manga was John Chad Pinball, which was published in 2022. This is a beautifully illustrated history on the game of pinball, something I used to do like all the time growing up. I grew up playing a lot of pinball, and at one point I actually tried to learn how to beat the machines, and I tried to learn all of the like advanced techniques, of which there's like a whole bunch of them. And so reading this was like an absolute delight and sort of like reminded me of that time that I used to spend playing these games. I even saw a couple of my favorite cabinets mentioned in this book, and I learned a lot about the game's history and like how it came to be and all of the ups and downs of its history. The back of the book also has all these really handy resources for like learning the game and for finding machines near you. So if you like pinball, definitely highly recommend. And lightning round for manga, because I don't really have a whole lot to say about it. I read Alice in Borderland Volume 1 and Volume 2. So a few years ago when I was like hardcore studying Japanese and like learning like immersion-based things, I was watching this J-drama on Netflix called Alice in Borderland. But the premise was interesting enough to keep me watching, even though I didn't like understand a whole lot of it. Because when you're learning through immersion, the big part of it is like making sure the content is compelling enough for you to keep enjoying it, even if you don't understand everything 100%. So I decided to read the manga all these years later. It's witty, it's gritty. It reminds me a lot of 999, if you've played that. Super good game. Just like witty and gritty and just very, very, very good. All right, so moving on to audiobooks. So the only audiobook I read this year was the very first one that I've ever read, which is Reggie Fils-Aimé's Disrupting the Game, narrated by Reggie himself. This copy was provided by Libro FM, so thanks, it sounded great. As you can tell by everything in the background here, video games have been a hobby of mine for a long time. The first piece of video game hardware I had was a Game Boy Color that I got for Christmas many, many years ago. A few years later, we got a GameCube and then a Wii, which I played, on and off while I was in high school. Before Nintendo Directs were a big thing, Nintendo used to have good old-fashioned like presentations and videos with their president and COO, Reggie Fils-Aimé. In his role at Nintendo, Reggie had this like huge, like larger-than-life personality, and he had this great way of speaking, which is just a joy to listen to. And with him narrating this audiobook of his, it's like 8 hours of just like listening to Reggie talk, and it's just like, oh, it's such a joy. It's so good. I specifically wanted to get an audio version of this book because it's narrated by Reggie Fils-Aimé. Again, it's over 8 hours, including an audio exclusive interview with Jeff Keighley. Jeff Keighley is the host of the Game Awards. Part business guidebook, part autobiography. The book takes you through all of Reggie's experiences and is framed by these little like teachable moments that he stops to explain. And there are these key points that he's learned from everything he went through. So even if you're not looking explicitly for business or career advice, there's still nice little bits of wisdom that you can take away from everything. It's incredibly uplifting to hear about his success through hard work, how things don't always work out, and how just empathy and humility like drive the heart of everything he does, and how that eventually translated to his work at Nintendo and how that shaped everything there. Between the feel-good narration and the teaching points and the stories of working at Nintendo, Disrupting the Game was one of my favorite books of the year. Okay, so on to fiction, finally. Somehow I didn't read as much fiction as I wanted to, but the ones that I did read were very, very good. And the first one is Jonathan Franzen, Crossroads, which was published in 2021. So this is the first Franzen novel that I've read. The corrections and purity sit on my shelf over yonder, untouched. But if they're anywhere near as good as Crossroads, then I certainly look forward to reading them. So this tells a story of the Hildebrandt family, and most of the action takes place on like one day in December in 1971. And like, this is no small book. Look at this. This is all one day, except for like some other parts that are like flashbacks, to give context and everything, and a couple days afterwards. But most of this is one day, which is insane. And it's very, very cool. It's from the perspective of the Hildebrandt family, all of whom are at this like crucial turning point in their lives. You could say a crossroads in their lives. Haha. And like everything is in just like vivid, like living color. It's so, so good. Just typical Franzen, a portrait of a middle-class suburban family in the Midwest on one day in 1971. That's it. For like 600 pages. That's amazing. I don't know how else to describe it, but like the characters are just like so real and so relatable that you end up just like empathizing for them, and you feel so bad for them when bad things happen to them because bad things happen to them, and you root for all of them and you feel bad for them, and then like it shifts perspective and you end up rooting for the other guy, and then like, oh my god, it's so good. So like amazingly, between all of these shifts in perspective and how it all takes place on like one day, everything like fits into place and it doesn't feel like it's like dragging on for too long. He like zooms into it with like all of this detail, makes the picture like all that more pretty. It doesn't get overplayed. It doesn't overstay as welcome. It's just like this one like very eventful day in December, like just filled with so much emotion and so much detail. There are no tricks here, no postmodern gimmicks, no metafictional storytelling. Just like 600 pages of like the best literary realism I've ever read. Very, very good. The next fiction book I read was Blake Crouch Upgrade. This was, without exaggeration, the literal worst book I've ever read, and so I won't waste any of your time by talking about it. Next up for fiction is Don DeLillo White Noise, which is a reread for me. So when I heard that this was getting a Netflix adaptation, I decided to like dust off this copy and like actually dig it out of storage, because when I first read this, I hated it so much that I threw it in the closet. And like, I was like, I'm never reading Don DeLillo ever again, because this was like the first of his books that I read. But then the Netflix movie got announced. I was like, okay, fine. I'll reread it, you know, after 5 years, maybe I'll like it more, maybe I'll understand it more. I decided I would just give it one more shot. So now, after everything, Don DeLillo is one of my favorite authors, so go figure. The narrative follows Jack Gladney, professor and pioneer of Hitler studies at College on the Hill, his wife Babette, and all of their children and stepchildren from previous marriages. So Jack's best friend Murray is also a professor at the college, and he's teaching his own course on like Elvis Presley. He's like working on like developing it and making it into its own field of study, and he's also doing this course on the cinema of car crashes and all this just like kind of like ridiculous stuff of like, why would you teach a course on that? And it's so ridiculous, and why are they treating these like silly subjects with so much academic seriousness? And it's just very, you know, absurd in that way. And so Murray is just like endlessly fascinated with like the supermarket and all of like the brightly colored labels and how everything is just, you know, marketed and like packaged. It's almost like a religious experience for him. Just being in the supermarket, he's just like entranced by all of like the signals that he gets there. So in part 2, there's this train that's carrying some sort of chemical and has this accident, and it begins like spewing this giant black cloud of like toxic fumes into the air. And so Jack's son, Heinrich, he watches from the roof with a pair of binoculars, and he's like listening along with his radio and listens to the news unfold in real time. And this event becomes known as the airborne toxic event. And so as the entire thing unfolds, the family is like glued to the radio and the television. Their whole perception of this real life event that's happening like, you know, right over there is being completely informed and like defined by TV and radio. In a way, this sort of predicts the way that we doom scroll today and obsessively follow the news, and how our perception of reality is very much influenced by, if not replaced by, you know, media and phones and television, and how that's kind of our window to the world in a way. And for context, this was published in 1985, well ahead of everything like that. These themes of simulacrum, in which media's representation of reality ends up replacing reality, or very much influencing our perception of reality, this theme shows up in a bunch of Don DeLillo's other work, like Libra and in Underworld. There's this really great bit that David Foster Wallace wrote about this in A Supposedly Fun Thing I'll Never Do Again, that I'm just going to straight up steal. So early on in the book, Jack and Murray go to this barn, and it's the most photographed barn in America. That's what it's marketed as. And so now reading from his quotation of White Noise. Several days later, Murray asked me about the tourist attraction known as the most photographed barn in America. We drove 22 miles into the country around Farmington. There were meadows and apple orchards. White fences trailed through the rolling fields. Soon the signs started appearing. The most photographed barn in America. We counted 5 signs before we reached the site. We walked along a cow path to the slightly elevated spot set aside for viewing and photographing. All the people had cameras, some had tripods, telephoto lenses, filter kits. A man in a booth sold postcards and slides, pictures of the barn taken from the elevated spot. We stood near a grove of trees and watched the photographers. Murray maintained a prolonged silence, occasionally scrawling some notes in a little book. No one sees the barn, he says finally. A long silence followed. Once you've seen the signs about the barn, it becomes impossible to see the barn. He fell silent once more. People with cameras had left the elevated site and replaced at once by others. We're not here to capture an image. We're here to maintain one. Can you feel it, Jack? An accumulation of nameless energies. There was an extended silence. The man in the booth sold postcards and slides. Being here is kind of spiritual surrender. We see only what the others see. The thousands who come here, the thousands who were here in the past, those who will come in the future, we've agreed to be part of a collective perception. This literally colors our vision, a religious experience in a way, like all tourism. Another silence ensued. They are taking pictures of taking pictures, he said. Like David Foster Wallace explains in this essay, this ends up being this like really excellent, like metafictional, like multi-layered, like nonsense thing. Again, quoting for a second. For not only are people watching a barn whose only claim to fame is being an object of watching, but the pop culture scholar Murray is watching people watch a barn, and his friend Jack is watching Murray watch the watching, and we readers are pretty obviously watching Jack the narrator watch Murray watching, etc. If you leave out the reader, there's a similar regress of recordings of barn and barn watching. There's little bits of white noise that I do like, and little bits of like early DeLillo that are like so good. And the barn is like one of them, but like most of it is like I still don't love it. I still don't think it's one of his best works. And like granted, I've read this and one other, which you'll see in just a minute. I know most of it is like almost certainly deliberate, but like so much of what I don't like about this book is how on the nose it is and how everything is like spoon-fed to you. To paraphrase Waste Mailing List's recent review of this, it's like he doesn't trust the reader to do the work and to just arrive at the conclusion by himself. It's like everything has to be handed to you on a silver platter to be like, isn't this ridiculous? Isn't consumerism very silly? It's too obvious. So I like this a lot better the second time around. It's still not my favorite DeLillo, but there's like a lot of good, like quintessential DeLillo in here that makes it still worth reading, in my opinion. So now finally on to my book of the year. It's Don DeLillo, Underworld. I'm ending this video with my book of the year because I have so much to say about it. This is a masterpiece of American fiction and one of the single greatest books I have ever read. So the year is 1951. There's this newspaper headline, and they're juxtaposed. One says, "Giants win pennant," and the other says, "Soviets explode atomic bomb." And these are placed with equal weights in the newspaper, one here, one there, both equally important. And so DeLillo sees this juxtaposition and knows that there's something there. And so this entire novel is just explaining everything about that. So the book starts with this beautiful 60-page story. I think it was originally published as a short story called Pafko at the Wall. It's an account of the shot heard around the world in baseball, not in history, which is the game-winning home run hit by Bobby Thompson to win the Giants the pennant against the Dodgers. And so the rest of the plot of this book is tracing where that home run ball went and like whose hands it went into and like where it went from there and like if it even exists anymore and like all of the places that this baseball has been throughout history. Part of what sets Underworld apart from White Noise and like everything else that I've read is like how deliberate and poetic DeLillo is about picking his language and how he repeats things in a certain way, and the language is so, it has like a rhythm to it. There's words that he deliberately picks to be like one after another, that these words go well next to each other, and that this sequence of words works rhythmically and like aesthetically, which you may say, oh, that's all fiction. Of course, that's like on purpose. Of course, he chose the words to be this way. But specifically, like the actual act of like reading the words and like looking at them, like it's like this word looks better next to this word. And he explains it really well in this one PBS documentary. Wish I could put into words. But the language in Underworld is like deliberately American English. And so when this was translated into French, DeLillo delighted in seeing that it says translated from the American. And DeLillo was like, oh, he just loved that it said American and not like translated from the English, because the language is, like I said, quintessentially, this is an American novel. This is like the definition of great American novel, at least in contemporary terms. You know, there's slang, and there's like all of this very nuanced like New York City language, and there's like Italian in here. Everything about it is so a product of its time in like this really beautiful way. And so back to the introduction for a second, that beautiful 61st pages. The opening scene is this little boy Cotter. He's 14 years old. He's getting ready to like jump the turnstiles to enter this baseball game, the baseball game between the Giants and the Dodgers. And it's just this unbelievable scene that he paints here. So reading from the introduction here, there are 4 turnstiles just beyond the pair of ticket booths. The youngest boy is also the scrawniest, Cotter Martin by name. Scrawny, tall, in a polo shirt and dungarees and trying not to feel doomstruck. He's located near the tail of the rush, running and shouting with the others. You shout because it makes you feel brave or because you want to announce your recklessness. They have made their faces into scream masks, tight-eyed with stretchable mouths, and they are running hard, trying to funnel themselves through the lanes between the booths, and they bump hips and elbows and keep the shout going. The faces of the ticket sellers hang behind the windows like onions on strings. Cotter sees the first jumpers go over the bars. 2 of them jostle in the air and come down twisted in a sprawl. A ticket taker puts a headlock on one of them, and his cap comes loose and skims down his back, and he reaches for it with a blind swipe, and at the other time, everything is at the same time. He eyes the other hurdlers to keep from getting stepped on. They are running and hurdling. It is a witless form of fight with bodies packed in close, and the gate crashing becoming real. They are jumping too soon or too late, and hitting the posts and radial bars, and doing cartoon climbs up on each other's back, and what kind of stoops must they look like to people at the hot dog stand on the other side of the turnstiles? What kind of awful screw-ups? A line of mostly men beginning to glance this way, jaws working at the sweaty meat and grease bubbles flurrying on their tongues. The gents at the far end going dead still, except for a hand that produces automatic movements, swabbing on mustard with a brush. And so between all of this talk of like baseball and like finding out where this home run baseball ended up through all the years are these themes of just like the psychology of crowds, trash, the Cold War, and again Simulacrum, which he does like unbelievably well in this book, way better than White Noise. And so again in the intro, like they hit the home run and everyone goes like bananas. They go crazy, and everyone just wants to be part of this big event. Like they won the pennant, not Bobby Thompson who hit the ball, but everybody won at the same time. And there's like confetti raining down, and people are like tearing up their tickets and throwing it just to be part of that big group, to be part of something. And then so they're like tearing things up and they throw them just to join in all of that. And like the language he uses to describe this like group psychology in this like enormous scale, like a baseball stadium full of people, and how they all feel in that moment where you're sort of like lose your individuality and become the crowd. Like the way he describes that is like unreal. It's so good. And so back to like Simulacrum for a minute, there's this scene which I think again was published as a short story by itself. It's like a home video that a girl is like recording. She's in the back of a car and she's recording the car behind them, and the man is a victim of like this highway shooting. She ends up accidentally capturing the moment that he's shot. Like you don't see any gory bits. The car veers off and then like that's it. She ends up unintentionally recording the only footage they have of the Texas highway killer, not the killer himself, but one of his acts. And so this scene is just like replayed over and over and over on television. What started out as just this guy doing this random killing spree becomes this way bigger thing because the television stations have to have this nice branded name for it, the Texas highway killer, so you remember who he is. And they show the same footage over and over. It's just another like prime example of like media representation of this event and this crime that ends up replacing it. Or in a better example, it exists because it's going to be filmed, and it exists to be perpetuated on television. There's another like beautiful scene in which all of these sort of artsy people in New York, they're in someone's loft, and each room has like all these televisions, and they're all playing the footage of the Kennedy assassination, the Zapruder film, just like on loop. Some of them are playing like super slow motion, some of them are playing it like super fast. And this is a big deal because like this is the first time the film has been, I don't know if it's like made public or if it's like the first time that people are being allowed to see it or whatever. They're watching it over and over in the same way that like news footage of like the Texas highway killer is just shown on loop. So that's sort of like meditation on like one image and like sort of looping that over and over, and like being so familiar with this recording of reality rather than experiencing reality itself is very much like how our understanding of like the Kennedy assassination is informed by like that film, how he unwittingly recorded like the only video footage we have of that assassination, and how like much of our understanding of that event comes from just this home movie this guy made. He just happened to record it one day. And so that theme is explored a lot in this book, which is very, very, very cool. On the one hand, I hope that I'm able to put this into words in such a way that it makes sense why it's such a good book. And I hope that I'm able to articulate what on earth this book is about and why I love it so much. But on the other hand, if I'm not articulate, if this is a rambling bit of nonsense and you can't tell what on earth is going on here, then I hope that that speaks volumes to how amazing this book is, in that I have such a hard time explaining what makes it so good. It's remarkably easier than like Gravity's Rainbow or like Infinite Jest, and for that reason it ranks like very, very highly among the fiction books I read because it's so accessible. But it still demands so much from you, and it's still like everything that makes maximalist fiction so good, and like the reason why I love it so much, because there's all these different bits of like baseball and paranoia and like trash and like all of these themes just like swirling around, and it all like makes sense, and like one part will happen here and then like hundreds of pages later you'll make the connection of like, you know, why that thing happened or who has the baseball or like who this character is. Everything falls into place, and it's beautiful. I don't know like how to explain it like better than that. Anyway, off my soapbox. Book of the year, Don DeLillo, Underworld. Please, if you read nothing else, read this book. Holy smokes. Whew. So that's everything. That's everything I read in 2022. It was a year of impulsive reading, like I said. And so what I'm doing for 2023, at least for now, no reading goals, no nothing. I had all these really great ideas for things that I wanted to do. Things like, oh, I'm going to read like more classics, or I'm going to read like 20 books this year. I'm not going to put a number to anything. I'm going to lean really hard into just focusing on like doing nothing. I'm not gonna like bog myself down with like reading goals or anything. Instead, I'm just gonna read impulsively and read deliberately and just check things off my list and actually make an effort to clear the backlog and to make progress on more giant books like this, because this is like very rewarding and worth the effort that I put into it. So I want to read more things like this. So that's it for this. If you made it this far, thank you so much for watching. You know how this website works. You can click whatever buttons you want. I don't care, whatever. Please let me know what you thought about books that I read in the comment section. What did you read? Did you read this book? Did you hate it? Did you love it? Whatever. Anyway, that's everything. Thank you so much for watching. I'll see you next time.